Welcome back to ABA Beyond the Data. I'm your host, Jay Burton, BCBA, and the dad of two awesome boys who just happen to be on the autism spectrum. This show is designed for behavior analysts and those who are looking to bridge the latest research to our professional practices. And it is dedicated to providing practical solutions to the practicing clinicians. And one of the most practical things we need to understand as practicing clinicians are the hours we prescribe. And yet, this may also be one of the weakest areas for many BCBAs. I can't tell you how many times I've been sitting with a BCBA student, or a new BCBA, or honestly, even a BCBA who's been doing this for years, and we get to the part of the treatment plan where it says recommended hours, and they type 40 hours per week like it's just the law of physics, like gravity. Like you don't even question it, you just write it, you sign it, and you move on. And then I go and do that annoying supervisor thing where I lean in and ask, okay, but why are we doing 40? And you can watch the brain buffering in real time. You know, that little loading circle you get on an Apple? It's like that. Well, because ABA. Or that's just what the clinic does, or my personal favorite, that's what insurance expects. And I'm not saying that to dunk on anybody. 40 hours is oftentimes a solid and good recommendation. I'm saying it because I've been there. I learned in a system where you saw certain numbers over and over, and after a while, you stop thinking of them as a decision and you start thinking of them as tradition. Like it came down from the mountaintop engraved on stone tablets. Thou shalt recommend 40 hours. But here's the problem. Families ask, funders ask, and they should ask. Because on the other side of that number is a real family schedule, real caregiver stress, real child care logistics, and real siblings to work with, and real finances. And a payer, an insurance company, that wants to do everything in its power to not fund ABA. But more importantly than that is a real life child that is going to have to live within that recommendation that you're making vibes. And if the best that we can do when we're challenged is to say, well, that's just what we do. We're not practicing science anymore. We're practicing vibes. And vibes don't hold up in peer review. And they for sure don't hold up in a peer review with another BCBA that has a sound understanding of why we recommend the hours that we do. Insurers aren't hiring weak BCBAs. They're finding good BCBAs that have good understanding of what is truly clinically necessary. And if you can't back it up, you're going to lose that peer review. So today's episode is basically me saying, let's clean this up. Let's stop acting like intensity recommendations are this mysterious thing that was only chosen for a few to understand. Because I've talked to so many BCBAs and students who genuinely have no clue where the whole 40 hours idea even came from. And even less understanding of how to make a recommendation that's defensible, individualized, and actually rooted in what the research and modern practice guidelines say. So here's what I'm going to cover in this episode. First, we're going to go back to where the 40 hours idea really took off, what a lot of people call the Lovaas years. We're going to talk about what was done, where it was done, what was measured, and why that work, love it, hate it, or feel complicated about it, became such a massive part of the foundation for intensive early intervention in ABA. Second, we're going to fast forward through the following decades and talk about what happened after that. Because it wasn't just one study and the field said, cool, that's it forever. There was replications, there were program models, and there were meta-analysis, big picture analysis, looking across studies to see what patterns hold up over time. We're going to pull from that body of work so that you understand why intensity became such a standard feature of comprehensive ABA programs. Third, we're going to get very, very clear on what modern guidelines actually say, especially the Council of Autism Service Providers, or CASP as they're oftentimes referred to, and their practice guidelines, and their recently published white paper in defense of the intensity of ABA interventions. Because CASP doesn't just throw out numbers, they define terms, they explain what counts and what doesn't count. They talk about intensity as medically necessary care, and they make statements in there that are honestly helpful for BCBAs who are tired of getting bullied into arbitrary caps by insurance. And fourth, and this might be the most important part of the whole show, we're going to talk about how to actually prescribe hours like a professional, not like somebody's that just doing what they're used to, like a real clinician. We're going to pull directly from CASP, and we're going to talk about tools like the Patient Outcome Planning Calculator, or POPC, which was created because, and I'm paraphrasing here, the field has historically not had a record of clean, standardized ways to translate clinical need in a defensible dosage recommendation. We're going to walk through how you can start making our recommendations that are as precise as possible and that you can actually defend in writing without sweating through your shirt. Now, before we jump in, quick reminder about CEUs. This show is ACE certified to provide CEUs to BCBAs, BCABAs, and occasionally BCBADs if they're out listening. And starting this year for RBTs, you can get your professional development units as well. And here's how it works. At 3 different points in this episode, I'm going to drop a keyword. I want you to jot that keyword down or voice memo it to yourself if you're driving. And if you want that CEU credit, you'll go over to aba-ceus.com after you listen, find this episode in the Get CEUs tab, and you'll enter those 3 keywords. Your submission gets reviewed, and then your certificate gets emailed to you in about 24 to 48 hours. All right, with that, let's jump on in, guys. Now, before we jump into the Lovaas years, I think it's important that we set the tone for the conversation because it matters. We can acknowledge where the field came from without endorsing everything about it. That's not a cop out. That's maturity, guys. Because if we pretend history didn't happen, we don't learn from it. But if we romanticize it, we also don't learn from it. And with early ABA literature, there are absolutely things that many of us disagree with today. Language used to describe autistic individuals, certain goals that were prioritized, the overall vibe of some of the work, honestly, just the vibe of how they were talking about these individuals. We can say that out loud that we disagree. At the same time, it's imperative that we understand where we came from because it shaped the infrastructure we still operate in today. It shaped the payer expectations, it shaped training models, it shaped what comprehensive ABA even means in the minds of families and the systems that we work in. And here's the key point I want to be very clear about. Sessions today should look completely different. They should be grounded in assent, dignity, and compassionate care, and using naturalistic teaching opportunities wherever possible, with a great focus, a high focus on quality of life, not compliance for the sake of compliance. But the core question of intensity, the density of learning opportunities over time, doesn't disappear just because we practice with more humanity now. Now, with that said, let's take off and go back to the origin. Let's understand how the 40 hours idea became a thing. And I think it's important to understand that the 40 hours idea didn't come from insurance companies meeting up and saying, hey, this is what the standard should look like, right? This is what we're willing to pay. No, it didn't come, man, it didn't come from a bunch of BCBAs coming together and saying, like, hey, is this a good number? Yeah, I think this is a good number. No, it came out of a specific historical moment in autism intervention. It came out of this time period in which the dominant attitude towards treating autism was basically there's not much you can do. And if you go back and read Lovaas's 1987 paper, he starts by describing how early psychodynamics approaches had promised recovery and didn't deliver. And then the pendulum swung hard in the other direction towards organic theories that offered little to no hope for major improvement through educational or psychological interventions. In his intro, he quotes a major review from the early 1980s that essentially framed autism as a developmental disorder with severe, largely permanent deficits that could not be treated. That's the mindset in the background. That's the era he's working in. The bar for progress was very low, and the expectation for outcomes were honestly bleak. So when people ask, why did anyone ever think intensity mattered? I want you to picture what the alternative looked like. Services were limited. Many families were getting minimal support, inconsistent special education, maybe a few speech sessions, like if they're extraordinarily lucky, if that. And there was still a strong institutional influence in the broader developmental disability world. The question wasn't, should we do 10 or 20 or 40 hours? The question was, do interventions do anything meaningful at all? And if your goal is not just managing a child's day, but actually changing developmental trajectory, language, the learning, the social engagement, then the logic of intensity starts to make sense because developmental change doesn't happen from 1 hour a week and good vibes. It happens from repeated teaching opportunities distributed across real life over time. That's the context Lovaas's model grew out of. And I want to say something clearly before I go any further. I am not hero worshiping the moment here. I'm explaining the origin story because our field is still living inside the ripple effects of this era, whether we like it or not. At the time, Lovaas simply saying, I think we can do more than just shoving these kids into institutions was profound. The bar for professionals actually caring about these kids' outcomes was that low. So when we read Lovaas's work today, we should remember that context. That doesn't make him in the right for the things he wrote or said. There were absolutely others of the time that were already speaking and advocating for a better and kinder approach. But unfortunately, they were few and far in between, and they were not the ones that chose to take up the mantle of this research. All right, so let's look at this origin story. In his famous 1987 paper, Lovaas describes what is essentially an early intensive behavioral treatment model. And he's very direct about what intensive meant. The experimental group, in his words, was worked with by well trained student therapists in the child's home, their schools, their communities for an average of 40 hours per week for 2 or more years. Not 10 hours, not 15, 40 for years. And it wasn't just a therapist showed up and ran programs. Parents were part of the treatment team the entire time and were extensively trained in the procedures, specifically so that the treatment could happen for almost all the subject's waking hours, 365 days a year. That sentence right there matters because it tells you that from the beginning, the underlying assumption was intensity wasn't a schedule, it was a strategy. The strategy was increase the density of learning opportunities so much that the child's whole day starts to function differently. The treatment itself, as described by Lovaas, was highly structured and heavily adult led. The conceptual basis was reinforcement theory with a big emphasis on discrimination learning. And the goal was pretty broad: reduce dangerous or disruptive behavior and build foundational learning readiness. That was their first goal. And then from there, language and play, then pre academic and broader social functioning. Lovaas actually layers out the progression year by year. Early goals included reducing self stimulatory and aggressive behaviors, teaching compliance to basic verbal requests, imitation, and early toy play, then moving into expressive language and interactive play, then moving into emotions, reading, writing, arithmetic, and observational learning. And he did all of this before he had the VB map or the ables to guide programming. So, pretty impressive if you think about the developmental trajectory that he laid out for these kids years before we had any assessment. And we also need to stop and be honest about the procedures that were included in that era. In the treatment description, he states, as a last resort, the team might use a loud no or a slap on the thigh contingent on undesirable behavior and incorrect responses. I'm not going to linger here, but I'm also not going to pretend it's not in the paper. That is not where compassionate, assent based ABA is today, and it shouldn't be. But it is part of where we came from, and it explains why some people hear ABA history and feel uncomfortable. That discomfort about where autism intervention started with ABA is real. That discomfort is real and valid. Another thing that it's important, and this is where the foundation for modern practice piece comes in, is that the model was designed to push generalization and inclusion. He describes deliberately extending the treatment into the community and into preschool group settings. And he talks about making a strong effort to mainstream kids into normal preschool placement. Again, we can disagree with the framing and the language, but you're seeing in the early version of something we still care about today, which is generalized skills in real environments, not just perfect responding at the table. Now, when you hear people summarize this study online or they talk about it in essays, they'll often say something like, Lovaas proved ABA works and that 40% of individuals with autism recovered. And they'll either oversell it or completely dismiss it. And I want to keep it grounded. One, the outcome definitions in the paper were very tied to school placement and IQ measures. For example, he describes rating systems where normal functioning included scoring in the normal range on intelligence tests and completing first grade in a normal class and being advanced by the teacher to the next grade. That's the metric set they were working with at the time. That doesn't mean those are the only outcomes that matter today, but it does show that the field was using proof for that era. You're not going to see a Vineland score or a VB map increase or a reduction on the cars like you would today's in our modern research. And two, the intensity, 40 hours per week, was part of the package. It wasn't 40 hours floating in space, it was 40 hours of structured teaching, extensive parent involvement, and deliberate generalization into school and community context. That matters because when people today say my kid gets 40 hours, we have to ask 40 hours of what? With what training and with what plan in place, with what quality, and what's the generalization strategy? Now, the 1987 paper is the one that gets the reference, right? It's the one that gets referred to most often. But the 1993 paper by McKeechan, Smith, and Lovaas is really what cemented the story in the field. Because it wasn't just, did kids improve at the end of the treatment? It was, did the gains actually last? In that 1993 follow up, they explained that the original study had 38 very young children. The children were split into experimental groups and control groups. And they described the experimental group very plainly. 19 children received 40 or more hours per week of one-to-one behavioral treatment for 2 or more years. The control group received much less intensive intervention, 10 hours a week or less of one-to-one behavioral treatment, plus whatever else they got through community services like parent training or special education. So, right there, you can see how 40 hours becomes a contrast point. It wasn't pulled out of a hat, it was the intensity level in the experimental condition of the study that became famous. They also describe how significant the needs were at intake for these kids. They purposely and specifically targeted individuals that today would be labeled as level 3 autism. These were kids with significant needs for support. The kids were all nonverbal, all had major deficits in receptive language, and none of them were playing with age appropriate toys, and none of them were engaging with their peers. And the overwhelming majority, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority engaged in severe tantrum behavior. And I'm not saying that to point a tragic picture. I'm saying it because intensity recommendations were being discussed for a population with substantial support needs and broad skill deficits across domains. And then comes the outcomes. At follow up, mean age was about 7 years old. The experimental group had gained an average of 20 IQ points and made major advances in educational achievement. And the headline number that gets repeated is this: 9 of the 19 kids completed first grade in regular classes on their own and had IQs in the average range. In contrast, across the control group, only one child, or about 2.5%, reached normal IQ levels and educational parity with their peers. Those outcomes, that data is the reason 40 hours gets stated over and over and over in later literature and literature. Even to this day, it is the reason why it is just the assumed number by so many BCBAs and so many clinics. So, okay, that's where the number came from. But the better question is, did later research support the idea that higher intensity matters? All right, guys, we're going to pause there for just a second. Our first key word of the episode is hours. Not hours, but hours, like hours of the day. HOURS, hours. All right, so after the Lovaas years, something important happened that honestly gets lost in the internet version of this story. The field didn't just say, well, one team at UCLA did this once, so 40 hours forever. What came next was more like a replication era. People trying to answer a very practical question. Can this kind of outcome happen outside of UCLA with different teams, different communities, different funding systems, and different versions of real life? And this is where I want to slow down for a second, because if you're listening to this as a practicing BCBA, this part should sound familiar. This is basically the same question we ask anytime a shiny new result shows up in research. Like, cool, But does it transport to the actual real life homes and lives of the kids we work with? Does it generalize? Can the average clinic actually do it? Can we do it with good training and good systems? Or was it a lightning strike that only happens in one place, in one environment? And through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, a series of replication studies occurred. And we could look at those individually, but overall, those replications showed that the Lovaas design worked across a variety of settings. And those single case studies are extremely helpful, but they're also vulnerable to the usual arguments. Small samples, different measures, different teams, different kids. This is why meta analysis matter. They're not perfect, but they're the field's attempt to say, okay, across multiple studies, what's the pattern? And a good place to start is with Eldvik and colleagues' 2009 meta analysis of early intensive behavioral intervention for children with autism, published in the Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology. In the paper, they describe EIBI using the definition pulled from early work, individualized and comprehensive. Lots of behavior analytic procedures directed by someone with advanced ABA training, with parents as active co therapists, delivered in a 1-to-1 setting. And they specifically look at intensive interventions that are receiving those high numbers between 30 and 40 hours per week of formal instruction. And when they actually run the numbers, they find similar results to what Lovaas found. On average, IQ scores go up, communication goes up. The one area of disagreement that they found was that adaptive behaviors only improved moderately. And another well cited meta analysis by Peter Schaefer and colleagues, which is oftentimes cited because it focuses on comprehensive ABA based early intervention programs. Now, for this meta analysis, they only gathered data that was across a 10-month period. So that is important when we hear the numbers. In their summary, they state that experimental groups receiving EIBI outperformed control groups on IQ, nonverbal IQ, expressive and receptive language, and adaptive behavior. Then they give a dosage snapshot that I think is incredibly useful for our topic. They report that experimental groups received on average 12.5 hours at the low end and 38.6 at the high end. And again, they find that those that received the intensive hours had a 11.98 increase in IQ and significant gains across social and communication domains. And they also make a point that I appreciate because it keeps the conversation honest. They say the difference on adaptive behavior was smaller than the difference on IQ and language. They literally suggest that future work might need to focus more on improving adaptive behavior, either with greater quantity of teaching or improved quality of teaching in those domains. That's right there in modern clinical takeaway. It's not just hours, it's what we do with the hours and what domains we're targeting. And unfortunately, at this time, they were not focusing on adaptive as much as they were focusing on communication, language, and cognition. And I really appreciate what they point out in this meta analysis. A sentence directly from it says that results varied considerably between studies and participants. Yes, because that is the part that gets lost when someone says research overwhelmingly supports 40 hours. The average pattern is real, and for a large portion of those with autism, ABA does work. But studies clearly show for some individuals, it does not make as much progress. Whether the concern is with the individual or with the practitioner that is implementing it, that is a harder question to answer. So here's what we can say from this research is that the general pattern across decades is that comprehensive ABA packages, often delivered at higher intensities, are associated with meaningful gains on average in cognitive outcomes, language outcomes, and to a more moderate degree, adaptive behavior outcome. And immediately after saying that, we have to say this: average effect doesn't predict your individual client. Two kids can receive the same number of hours and look completely different in response. Some learners are rapid, some are moderate, some need very different engineering of instruction, and sometimes what changes the outcome isn't adding 5 more hours, it's changing the quality of teaching, the setting they're in, or the reinforcement system. Now, before we shift away from the replication era, there is one paper that I really find interesting for this topic. It's Howard and colleagues 2005, because this paper hits different, but it's equally important to Lovaas's work. It's titled A Comparison of Intensive Behavior Analytic and Eclectic Treatments for Young Children with Autism, published in Research and Developmental Disabilities. Man, they have really long title names, don't they? Right from the abstract, they lay out the design in a way that is super relevant to what parents are choosing today. They compared three groups of preschool age children with autism spectrum disorder. One group of 29 children received intensive behavior analytic treatment. They describe it as 1-to-1 adult to child ratio, 25 to 40 hours per week. Then they had an intensive eclectic group of 16 kids getting about 30 hours per week in public special education classrooms using a combination of methods. And then a third group, 16 kids in a non intensive public early intervention program, which was about 15 hours per week, mostly in small group fashion. The key piece here is that they used independent examiners to administer standardized tests and assessments at intake and again about 14 months later. So this isn't the clinic graded their own homework. These programs were measured by an outside group looking in that had no bias here. And at intake, the groups were similar across domains and across variables. But at follow up, the intensive behavior analytic group had higher mean standard scores across every domain they measured: cognitive, language, adaptive. And the difference wasn't minor, it was statistically significant across all domains except motor skills, in which unfortunately there was statistically no difference. But every other domain showed significant improvement, not just a marginal difference, significant. Intensive eclectic services, which is basically a grouping of school services, OT, speech, and low intensity school generic services, didn't separate much from each other, but intensive behavior analytic treatment did. And the authors lay it down pretty strongly there. They point out in their conclusion that even when you combine the progress made in the other two groups, it still did not surpass the behavior analytic work and progress that they made. Those are some fighting words right there. That's some fighting words. I'm sure glad that mostly BCBAs listen to this. And again, the point of this study was not to point out that these other services are weaker. And I think every single BCBA can agree that the school services, that the SLPs, the OTs, those combined services are imperative to the work that we do. But the point of this study and others like it was to say that putting them into a school system where they're only going to get OT and speech is not enough. Not when you can consider the fact that they can literally make twice as much gains if they were to do intensive ABA services. So when we think of this long story, this long history of how have we gotten to the number of hours that we have gotten to today, we can see that Lovaas started us off at looking at some pretty basic numbers. those that were receiving intensity and low intensity services. Replication studies came afterwards and showed that yes, this does stick. And then Howard and his colleagues in 2005 said not only does this work, it works better than the other alternatives that are out there by a 2-to-1 margin. That is why it's so important for us to explain to parents that yes, school is important, absolutely. And yes, we want them to succeed in school and we want SLP to be there and we want OT to be there. But it is important for them to understand that when it comes to the treatment of autism, ABA is the gold standard by 2-to-1 margins. All right, I'll get off my high horse, but it is important to understand this. So we've talked through where the 40 hours idea originally got traction. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, Jay, I get the history. I get it. That's great. But what am I supposed to do with this when I'm writing a treatment plan? And that's what we're going to go over in this next section. I'm going to anchor this section heavily to the Council of Autism Service Providers, or CASP, recently published work titled Evidence about ABA Treatment for Young Children with Autism, the Impact of Treatment Intensity on Outcomes. If that is not exactly what this episode is all about, then I don't know what this episode is all about. And the reason I like this document is that it's written to cut through the noise. It's basically CAF saying, here's the standard of care. Here's what the research actually shows, and here's why ours isn't a random number. And I want to start with how it defines what we mean when we say treatment intensity. To CASP, treatment intensity is the number of hours of direct ABA treatment delivered to the child per week. That's direct treatment, not supervision, not parent training, not time with the BCBA spending programming, right? But it also does not include school, speech therapy, or OT. It's the direct active intervention hours where the patient is engaged in therapeutic interactions with an RBT or BCBA one-to-one. And the reason this matters is because payers will sometimes try to stack everything together and say, well, the child is already receiving 40 hours total of services. But that's not what the research on ABA intensity is measuring. And it's not the metric that supports the standard of care recommendations for comprehensive ABA. The next thing this paper does that I absolutely love is it explains the relationship between scope and intensity. CASP describes scope of treatment as the breadth and the depth of what you're targeting. In other words, are you doing comprehensive work across developmental domains, or are you doing focused work on a narrow set of outcomes? And they describe scope as a continuum. On one end, you have the comprehensive treatment, multiple domains, lots of targets, and comprehensive has some big goals with it. You are trying to accelerate learning trajectory, close developmental gaps, and build learning to learn repertoires. On the other end, you have focused treatment, which is going to focus in on just a few domains and just a few concerning behaviors. So, scope and intensity absolutely have to go hand in hand. That's not a random opinion, it's logical. If you have comprehensive scope, language, communication, play, social skills, daily living, learning readiness, emotional regulation, reduction of maladaptive behaviors, if you're focusing on all of that, if you're truly addressing the big picture, then by definition, you need enough intensity to create enough learning opportunities to move the needle across all of those domains. And they note some really helpful examples in this. They note that focused goals, like helping a child develop a small set of peer social skills, might require something like 6 to 15 hours per week to produce meaningful changes in the domain. That makes sense. You got a narrow goal, single domain, so you get fewer hours. But then they give a second example that hits differently, and I think a lot of us know this one, a focused plan that requires a focus on intense behaviors or focused on intense safety concerns. CASP notes that such situations may require a more intensive level of services, even though it is more focused, so that the rate of acquisition can be more rapidly met in that single domain that you're focused on. And they make a really good point there in the paper that if you're working specifically to reduce maladaptive behaviors, you're not really just working to reduce maladaptive behavior. You're working on increasing tolerance. You're working on teaching functional communication. You're working on installing replacement repertoires and doing safety training that cannot be rushed, right? So it's not just a focus on behaviors, right? But they land the point that with comprehensive, the treatment is aimed at improving developmental trajectories across domains. This means that high intensity is required, but additionally, time is required. Not hours, but the time that it's going to take for the services to last, for the actual changing of the needle to occur. This right here is why ours is not supposed to be a random guess or based on opinion. It's supposed to be a dosage decision tied to scope and need. And the paper makes it clear and easy to understand in a single statement. Children should receive an average of 30 to 40 hours per week of direct intervention for 2 or more years when the model is early, comprehensive, intensive ABA treatment. And the paper does not say this casually or lightly. The paper explains substantial treatment time is essentially shorthand for the large number of learning opportunities required for a young child to catch up, and they note that best outcomes are shown when the child is in services for 2 or more years. And if you're sitting there listening and thinking, okay, but that's just CASP repeating an old talking point, we already know that. No, the paper goes into the evidence base, and this is where it gets really relevant. They highlight a very recent meta analysis approach led by Eldvik and colleagues, and they conducted an individual participant data meta analysis, which is basically a fancy way of saying they're not just averaging study levels, which is way too common in a meta analysis. They're analyzing participant level across studies to look at the relationship between intensity levels and outcomes. In the CASP summary of that work, they report data from 341 young children who received comprehensive ABA of varying intensities. Average age at intake was just over 3 years old. The pooled data came from 15 peer reviewed prospective controlled studies. This team specifically pooled studies where the treatment met the defining features of comprehensive ABA, behavior analytic, individualized, addressing all domains, directed by people with advanced ABA training, BCBAs. That matters because the whole controversy around intensity is that you can't interpret intensity effect if you're comparing apples to oranges. If some kids in the study are getting comprehensive ABA and others are getting focus that may be on about, behaviors or safety, intensity gets confounded with scope, right? This meta analysis is trying hard to hold that scope constant. And once they'd found kids that were doing comprehensive ABA, they divided the group up by intensity. Low intensity was about 5 to 12 hours per week. Moderate intensity was about 13 to 25 hours per week. And high intensity was 26 to 40 hours per week. And then they looked at changes across major domains using standardized measures. Things like adaptive functioning through the Vineland, cognitive functioning through standardized IQ types, and the autism severity through measures like the Childhood Autism Rating Scale. And here's what CASP paper reports. There was a strong relationship between intensity level and the amount of change across measures. For cognitive functioning, the average change was about 22 standard score points for children in high intensity groups compared to about 11 points in low intensity groups. So literally about double the gain. No, literally double the gain on average when you compare high intensity to low intensity in that data set. For adaptive behavior, the same pattern showed up. Children in high intensity group showed larger improvement than moderate, and moderate showed larger improvement than low. And for autism severity, the direction was also consistent. Greater intensity was associated with larger reductions in the severity scores on the CARS and other autism diagnosing tools. The overall pattern across credible research, especially when you're talking about comprehensive ABA for young kids, is that higher intensity is associated with better outcomes on average, and this CAST document is very direct about that. And I actually love the way they frame hours. In plain language, they explain that the number of hours is essentially a shorthand for the number of learning opportunities. During high quality ABA, you have structured learning opportunities and you also have spontaneous embedded opportunities like transitions, play, meals, routines throughout your day, where skills generalize and become functional. And when an intensity is too low for comprehensive goals, the child simply does not contact enough opportunities to catch up across all of those domains. Fewer learning opportunities usually means slower progress or progress in fewer areas. That's not a moral statement. That's how learning works. When you don't have enough opportunities to learn, you're not going to learn that subject. So when you put this all together, here's the takeaway that matters from this paper. CASP, the Council of Autism Service Providers, one of the largest organizations that advocates for autism services and works with insurance payers, is giving you permission and, frankly, the responsibility to treat hours like a dosage, to define what hours mean, to make sure your intensity recommendation matches your scope, to understand that comprehensive treatment designed to shift developmental trajectories is, in most cases, going to require high intensity hours to create enough learning opportunities. And at the same time, to individualize, because even in this document, CASP emphasizes compassionate, individualized care that considers patients and families and what they have preferences for. So if you're hearing me say that CASP supports 30 to 40 hours of comprehensive early intervention and you're thinking, well, that means everybody gets 40 hours. No, that is not what they're saying. They are saying it still needs to be individualized and focused on family and client preferences and needs. That's what they're saying. They are saying that for comprehensive early intervention, that intensity is part of the mechanism that makes ABA work for this group of individuals. It's part of how you generate enough learning opportunities to close the gap. And honestly, this is something you should be able to explain clearly. And this is where we're going to pivot into the most practical part of the episode. Because now that we've defined hours correctly and we've grounded why intensity matters, the next question is, how do you actually prescribe hours in a defensible way that doesn't get shredded by insurance and doesn't collapse into, well, this is just how we've always done it? But before we go there, we're going to pause for just a second. Your second keyword is recommend. 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 Like you should recommend this podcast to your fellow BCBAs. And here's the hard truth. Most of us were trained to defend hours, not calculate them. If I'm being honest, a lot of my early training sounded like, here's the typical range for this age group. And then the rest of training was basically how to survive peer-to-peer calls or how to write a treatment plan in such a way that you don't have to go into them at all. There was so little focus on how to prescribe hours precisely. And look, being able to defend medically necessary care matters. It really does. But if all we can do is defend a number after the fact and we can't clearly explain how we got there in the first place, then we're vulnerable, not just to insurance pushbacks, but honestly, we're vulnerable to being inconsistent clinicians. So, in this section, I'm going to give you a repeatable framework you can use yourself. It's not a magic equation, but it will move you from I feel like they need 30 to here's exactly why the dosage is 30. Here's what it buys us in learning opportunities, and here's how we'll know if it needs to go up or down. And I want to anchor this back to CASP and what they say. And then I'm going to layer in ideas from a newer dosage planning paper that I think the field should pay a little attention to. Because CASP says something that should basically be the BCBA anthem for this topic. They say clinicians who have directly observed and treated the patient are best positioned to recommend the appropriate number of hours. If that's not a yes, amen statement, then I don't know what is. Hallelujah. Yes, we BCBAs do know what is best for our clients, believe it or not. They also say that when there's uncertainty about the appropriate level of intensity, the practitioner should err on the side of caution by providing a higher level of service intensity, and evidence of failure at a lower intensity should not be required to access a higher intensity of care. That's a strong stance. And another amen hallelujah statement right there. But that is also a lot of pressure on BCBAs, especially new BCBAs that haven't really rooted themselves yet in either the research or the know how or experience to make these clinical calls. So, I'm going to walk you through a few different methodologies of calculating hours. The first method is probably the most common methodology out there. I'll call this methodology clinical judgment. The second is an actual, true to nature calculation, and it's based on trials to criterion. So let's start with the clinical judgment side, right? Step one in this process is for you to identify the treatment model and scope. You're deciding, is this focused or comprehensive? And you don't decide that based on intuition. You decide it based on how many domains you're addressing and how broad the skill deficit and barriers are. If you're targeting safety and feeding, following routines, or one major barrier that's choking progress, that might be focused. If you're targeting communication, play, social, daily living, learning readiness, behavior reduction, and generalization across settings, that's going to be comprehensive, guys. An easy way to think about this is to look at the domains in your assessment. If around 80% of tested domains a child is falling below age range in, then that is likely going to need comprehensive services. If only about 30% of domains need support, then focused is going to be a better option. That is not a golden standard to go by, but keep that in your mind when you're making that sort of decision. Step two is to define the why in behavioral terms. The rationale is what skill deficits and behavioral barriers are driving restricted access, suffering, or dangerous outcomes. What does the learner currently not have that is preventing them from living a safer, fuller, more independent life? And then, this part is huge, what replacement repertoires must be built first? Because if a learner is engaging in aggression or self injury, the first priority isn't let's do a giant curriculum across 15 domains. The first priority is we need communication, tolerance, transitions, choice making, functional engagement, and safety responding. Those are all prerequisites. And the more severe the risk, the more urgent the skill building becomes. Step three is where we start turning clinical thinking into dosage. You translate goals into what I call instructional demands. And I want you to think about this the same way you'd think about strength training. You can't build a big repertoire on 2 reps a day. If a learner needs functional communication and tolerance and daily living and play and social engagement, and you're only getting a handful of real learning opportunities per day, then outcomes ceilings are going to be hit fast, no matter how brilliant your treatment plan is. So, step three is, do I have enough time? Step four is you factor in generalization and caregiver capacity, but you do it in a way that respects real life. This is the parents' lens piece. It's not parents should do more. It's plans must fit reality. Let me say that one more time because I don't hear BCBAs understanding this enough. Plans must fit reality. If you write an intensity recommendation that assumes a caregiver can run 2 hours of homework every night after being an ABA and after they've been at work all day, you are kidding yourself. So, if family isn't going to be able to support in the same way that you want them to, then you may need to consider more hours. And then step 5 is you factor in behavior severity. And then step 5 is to consider barrier behaviors and maladaptive behaviors and the severity and risk that they have. I'm not just talking about maladaptive behaviors themselves, such as tantrums and aggression and property destruction. We're also talking about other barriers, such as hyperactivity, such as feeding issues, such as low attention, such as a low rate of acquisition. Very few or very hard to provide reinforcements or even medical health. All of these things need to be considered in your determination of hours. So if you have a client that has a quote unquote focused ABA intervention, which typically only needs 10 to 25 hours per week, but the severity of barriers such as medical concerns, such as low motivation, if any of those factors are there, you need to write in your treatment plan in plain language explaining the profile of the individual and the complexity that requires a higher intensity to achieve safe outcomes. Now, from this, you don't actually get a real number. What you get is a guess. And if you are a good clinician, it's going to be a good guess. But if you are a newer clinician, you may be looking for that specific number that tells you exactly how many hours you should be writing down on your treatment plan. And that's where the trials to criterion method comes in. And CASP literally tells you what hours are standing in for. They say the number of service hours is a proxy for the total number of therapeutic interactions like learning opportunities. And of course, taking into account complexities of the case, whether it be health or behaviors or any of the other barriers out there. That is such a powerful thing to understand because the question becomes from there, how many learning opportunities can we get into a week? And if we can calculate that, we can literally calculate how many hours we can give. So, practically, what we can do is look at the number of long term goals, not individual targets, but long term goals. Like the domain of listener responding might have long term goals of following simple directions or identifying common objects or maybe following or selecting the direction to point to something, right? Each of these long term goals might have a dozen or more targets in them but will likely vary a little bit, right? Some goals might just have like transitions from high preferred to low preferred. That might be a long term goal, but just because of how difficult it is. But something like identifying common objects, right? That is going to have a lot more targets in it, right? And then I ask from there if we want progress that actually generalizes how many high quality teaching opportunities per long term goal per week do we need? And keep in mind, some studies show that kids with autism oftentimes need over 100 trials to meet criterion per target. So if you have 10 targets in your long term goal, you could be looking at over 1,000 trials to master out that long term goal. That's a lot. So if your plan requires thousands of repetitions across months, but your schedule only allows a couple hundred meaningful trials, you're underdosed, way underdosed. So think of it like this. How many learning opportunities can this child tolerate per hour? If the child is coming in with a high level of barriers and a high level of behaviors, they're likely not going to be able to tolerate a high rate of programs run per hour. And then consider the trials to criterion. And if it is a new client, You will likely not have this exact number at your first assessment, but you can speak with the parents about how quickly they see new skills develop. If they report it typically takes just a few interactions for a new word to develop, great. You can assume the trials to criterion is going to be low and the rate of acquisition is high. So let's do a real life example here. A child comes in at age 3 and scores a 20 on the VB map, which is low level 1 score for those familiar with it. And those that are not familiar with it, it is a child scoring between about 0 and 18 months age range. So this tells me across measured domains in the VB map, the child has scored essentially below every single domain. So let's say we look at the VB map and we determine over the next 6 months, we want to focus on 6 domains in the VB map and pull 5 long-term goals from each domain. So that's about 30 long-term goals for this child. That's pretty typical for a treatment plan. And we speak with the parents and they feel it takes a lot of opportunities to learn a new skill. And you see the same during the assessment. So you assume the average trials to criterion per target for this child based on research to be about 100. So her long-term goal, let's just average it, takes 1,000 trials to master a whole long-term goal. And remember, some long-term goals might have 2 targets in them, some might have 100, right? So we're just averaging it out. You could literally count out how many trials you're actually going to have if you like to do that math. You would just take the true number of targets you're going to have for the child and multiply that by 100. But let's say, on average, we're going to have 30 long-term goals, roughly 10 targets in each, with 100 trials to criterion. It's going to take about 30,000 trials to master all of those goals. That's 30,000. Walk with me. Point to the fish. What color? 30,000 of those questions, which sounds crazy, but as we break down these numbers, it's actually not that bad. Okay, so we're in this example and we speak a little bit more to the parents and we learn he has a very low level of behaviors and very few barriers that keep him from getting targets run. So he is ready to work and loves engagement. This is great news because that means the number of programs we can run per hour can be decently high. So let's say our RBTs are competent enough to run, say, 35 programs per hour. I think that's a good number. I'm in a very play-based clinic. Some of you might be saying, hey, 35 isn't enough. Some might be saying, wow, that's a lot of programs per hour. But for the sake of this, let's just say 35 programs per hour. So we take 30,000 trials, the total number of trials we need to have ran over the next 6 months, and we divide it by the number of weeks in 6 months, which is 26. So 30K divided by 26 is about 1,150. We then divide that number by the number of trials we believe that this child can hit per hour, which in this case is 35. So 1,150 divided by 35, which comes to 33 hours per week. And I know that's a lot of math and a lot to remember. I'll be sure to write that trials to criterion uh, equation into the description of the show. But you have to remember, by doing this, you are leveling the playing field in your advantage because you have created a standard measurement, a standard dosage for providing your clients, and a standard dosage, a standard method to come to that dosage is extremely defensible in front of insurance. Now, the reality is that even with this perfect number of hours recommendation, doing clinical judgment is still important. Mixing those two systems together is going to come to the most precise hours because, yes, trials to criterion can give you a really good standard to go off, but you also have to truthfully go off of what your clinical judgment says. And if you don't feel competent to do that yet, that is where you also need to pull in other BCBAs. Now, there is this interesting paper in the Journal of Behavioral Analysis and Practice by Lauren Toby and colleagues called Developmental and Preliminary Validation of Patient Outcome Planning Calculator, or POPC. It is a tool for calculating the number of hours that a client should be receiving. Essentially, doing what I just walked through, but in a formalized tool. And I need to be very clear at this time, at the time of recording this, the tool is not publicly available for download or for using. The clinic that made it has not published it, but they have talked about publishing it around 2026, which, hey, it is 2026, so maybe we'll be looking at it soon. But the paper is valuable right now because it names the problem directly that the field is having and proposes what a standard approach could potentially look like. They say very plainly that BCBAs are responsible for determining medically necessary dosage, but because there is currently no standard method for making these dosages, these determinations by BCBAs can vary largely. And they point out the obvious clinical judgment may be underdeveloped in new BCBAs, so a more formal strategy is needed for helping guide them to make the best decision. And that's not an insult. That's reality. I remember being a brand new graduate student. Man, I was struggling and sweating to get those dosages correct and having to seek other BCBAs to get their judgment and put in. But having a tool that would actually have just popped out an answer for me, that of course I would speak with other BCBAs about, but it would at least give me a ballpark. I would have loved that as a graduate student or as a recent grad and new BCBA. Now, I'm not telling you PopC is the future or you should even use it because it's not publicly available. I have not used it. I'm saying they are pointing out a valid concern. I'm saying this is the direction the field needs to move. We need framework that standardizes what we consider when we prescribe hours because that protects clients, that protects clinicians, and makes our recommendations more defensible. All right, guys, we're going to pause here for our third keyword, which is calculate. 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 So as we start to land this plane, I want to zoom out and make the point that I think matters most. Because if we miss this, the whole episode just turns into an argument about numbers. The future of our field is not going to be built on whether you personally like 40 hours or you hate 40 hours. It's not going to be built on whether you're a high intensity clinic or a low intensity clinic. The future of our field is going to be built on whether we can prescribe intensity the way real healthcare disciplines prescribe dosage, based on assessed needs, defined mechanisms, and measurable responses to treatment. And right now, if we're being honest, we're in this awkward adolescent stage as a field where we know intensity matters, we know quality matters, we know individual variability is huge, but we don't always have shared, standardized methods for calculating hours that we can defend consistently across clinicians, across locations. That doesn't mean clinical judgment is bad. Clinical judgment is necessary. CASP is clear about that, and I'm being clear about that. But here's the tension. When we rely only on judgment without shared rules, we create unnecessary vulnerability. Not because our intentions are wrong, but because inconsistency is easy to attack. And that's why I'm arguing we need stronger standardization around how we calculate and justify hours. I have given you research methods for calculating hours that are backed by CASP, but that is far from a universal standard. It can be your standard, and keeping your own standard does allow you to better defend your own work because defensible standards protect clients. When we have clear, more consistent reasoning, it becomes harder for payers to arbitrarily deny or cap services that are medically necessary. It protects access, and access matters. And it protects families too. Families deserve clarity. Families deserve to hear, here's why your child needs this intensity, in language that makes sense with a plan that doesn't feel like mystery. And families also deserve honesty when the intensity recommendation is too high, because high intensity impacts daily life. Standardization helps us explain the why without sounding like we're squeezing more hours out of a kiddo. It protects clinicians, and if you're a BCBA listening to this, you know exactly what I mean. When the rules are fuzzy, the loudest voice in the rooms win. Sometimes that's an insurance reviewer. Sometimes that's the clinic owner. Sometimes that's the how is this always been done supervisor. But when we have strong defensible frameworks, the conversation shifts from power to evidence. And that means fewer arbitrary denials, fewer absurd peer-to-peer calls where you feel like you're defending your entire profession, and fewer situations where new BCBAs are forced to guess and hope they guess the number that won't get shredded. And finally, it protects the credibility of ABA, because if the public perception becomes ABA just recommends high hours because it's profitable, we lose trust, and that has already started. And we should be losing trust if we can't clearly articulate the rationale. But if we can say, here is the history, here is the research base, here is what modern guidelines actually define and recommend, and here is how we translate assessed needs into defensible dosage decisions, that's a different conversation. That's healthcare. That's professionalism. So let me bring it home with the line I want you to remember. The goal isn't to blindly prescribe 40. The goal is to prescribe what's needed and know exactly why it's needed. All right, guys, that's our show. As a reminder, if you want CEU credit for this episode, go over to aba-ceus.com. Find this episode in the Get CEUs tab and enter the 3 keywords that I dropped throughout the episode. Your submission gets reviewed, and then your certificate gets emailed to you. And if you want to track down any of the research or articles I referenced today, just check the episode description on whatever platform you're listening on. I'll have the sources listed there. And if you like this episode, leave a review or a comment. Share it with your friends or a student struggling to determine hours. Thanks for spending this hour with me and for the work you're doing for the kids and families we serve. I'm Jay Burton, and as always, thanks for going beyond the data.
Bye, see you next time.